Oh, the problem is, there's a problem.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So we'll be looking at starting, but I just want to quickly show most of you some of the resources that you should be able to access from Moodle. For those of you who are doing this particular course. So obviously we're doing this particular unit, which is working in health and social care sector. And then, we've got presentations and obviously bits and pieces that we have discussed in terms of articles and other things that I've uploaded, here. So I'm also going to put in the learning outcome 5, which we are going to discuss today. And there are 2 or 3 associated handouts, which obviously are going to be a good read. And the links to these are also available on the presentation, but they will also help you understand a bit better in terms of, how do we look at planning a care or care planning? What is a care plan and what is care planning? So today we are going to be focused on, obviously understanding care planning in this particular unit. Oh. So let's make a quick start. I think we'll let the others join, keeping in mind some of the sessions, tend to be a bit longer. So what I want to make sure is that we are able to complete some of these on time. So let's look at learning outcome 5 today. Do we have any? So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. Do we have any questions from, previous session, which is learning outcome 4, which was discussing yesterday, relationships, partnerships, and teamwork, which is required primarily to work within the health and social care sector. So any questions from yesterday's session? Some of you, if you've gone through this stuff, do we have any questions on that side? Okay. So if you think of any over a period of time, then you keep noting them down, because when we do the assignment discussion, which will be next week, including learning outcome 6, what we'll do is we'll take these questions up so that, we are able to comprehensively discuss and then relate them to the assignment, which has to be completed for this unit. Now, in today's session, we are looking at understanding what is a care plan and what is a planning that we do in order to make that care plan comprehensive, and then how is that care plan a single document which everyone refers from the practitioner side. That means people who are involved in delivering care to the patient, termed as practitioners, nurses, healthcare professionals, assistants, doctors, medics, family, friends, and they look at reading into this particular plan and interpret this plan in one particular way. And that is what I would suggest is what our discussion is going to be with regards to today, when we talk about the process of understanding the principles of care planning. Now, there are 3 assessment criteria. One is we need to understand what is the purpose of planning or care. Second, we look at what are the roles and responsibilities of care and how the planning is done. And then when we will also talk about things which are related to analysis and reviewing. Analysis would involve what are the barriers which are faced by practitioners when they're trying to implement a care plan. So for example, if you have a patient who's 65 years old, we'll take up a case study, and she receives support from different set of people because she stays at home, but there is also discussions with the local authority to move her to a care home, wherein the care could be provided in a much better and in a much better way, which is basically meeting her expectations, the patient's, or the, as we will say, the subject M's expectation. And we look at how this planning requires, let's put it this way, how the activities require meticulous planning so that the patient is able to receive the care they need. And in the review section, which is the 5D1 task, we're going to be looking at focusing on understanding what are the challenges which are faced by in general health and social care settings, when they are trying to implement a plan. So there could be challenges from compliances, legislation, family members, practitioners, lack of training, lack of knowledge. We look at all these challenges and how these challenges are overcome, and that would focus on the critical review for the learning outcome. Now, as always, there's a fair bit of content that we need to look at in terms of the indicative content to discuss this particular learning outcome. And I have a presentation. I was looking to get hold of a video which could relate to, care planning and how, care is provided. So what we will do is also look at a video in particular, which will talk about, what is care planning and how care planning is essentially done. Now, there are lots and lots of, videos which are available, but generally speaking, I'm going to be looking at pulling out something which is short and, let's say, directly related to how a care plan is put together, for a particular individual. So before we start, what I would want to do is let's look at, listening into this particular video, which is on the NHS website. And it basically talks about, personalized care, because some part of this content that we're going to be discussing repeatedly would be focusing on the 6 principles of care, person-centered approach. And obviously, why care plans are put together is primarily to ensure that when service in the form of care is being provided, or medication or treatment to an illness is being provided, this is provided in a way which is best suited for the patient. This is provided in a way which best meets the requirements of the patient and is able to help the patient get better. So there is a section on NHS, and this is an important part of the NHS Act of 2010, wherein putting people's first, which was introduced in 2007 as a concept, and later on the PCA approach was adapted and adopted. The putting people first as an approach was adapted and adopted into the NHS, which is basically person-centered care. Now, there is a big emphasis on this within the National Health Service, and all care which is provided, whether it's care for, primary care, secondary care, acute care, end-of-life care, mental health care, any sort of care which is provided within the National Health Service, and, services across the globe. There are similar systems in Australia and Canada, which mirror very closely what the National Health Service is here in the UK, in Ireland in particular, but there are other countries like the US and some of the developing countries in the Indian subcontinent. When you look at Africa in particular, there the care is partly provided by the government and partly it is subsidized by taking out an insurance policy wherein the customers end up paying premium. So I don't know how many of you remember, President Obama's presidency focused on introducing, something which was the one care system in the US, which is very closely mirroring what the National Health Service is. And countries like Nigeria, Ghana have implemented, similar versions of the National Health Service or a system very similar to the UK in their countries to be able to provide, different types of care to members of public and citizens within their country. So personalized care is a very important aspect, specifically because it relates to the choice and allows the individual to make the decisions by providing extensive information relating to the treatment, relating to, what kind of care they would be needing after the, say, operation or clinical, after the medication or illness or, operation is done. And that would be highlighted in this particular video. So we look at this particular video, which basically talks about the story of Dylan. And he has been on a wheelchair, and obviously his care plan, because he suffers from cerebral palsy, his care plan was, essentially put together in discussions with him, and it allows him to live a healthy and a meaningful life, even though he has what is called the cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy is a condition in which you would generally see, the brain getting affected. And in this case, it is related to the fact that when we talk about, this particular condition, the functions of the brain, it's a lifelong condition. The function of the brain, affects, the brain isn't able to control, So let's say it's a nervous system disorder. It is affected, it basically affects the brain, and the brain is not able to control the movements of the individual or coordinate the movements of your arms and limbs. So it's a disorder essentially wherein the person's ability to move and maintain balance and posture is severely dented because of the conditions affecting brain and the nervous system. So it basically affects the muscle. So let's look at listening into his personalized plan, which was put together by a group of practitioners in the NHS, and that will give us a very good perspective of what it is when we talk about care planning. So it will give us a bit of a background in terms of what he does, where he lives, and obviously, basic bits.
Moving on September the 9th, in fact, and I'm going to do computer forensics, which will hopefully allow me to give something back to the community and to say thank you for everyone who helped me get this.
This is the first time I've actually seen the process go from start to finish, and it's been an amazing experience for me, and it's quite emotional really, because I didn't realise what a huge impact it could have on somebody's life and the opportunities that we can now provide to them.
In a nutshell, the wheelchair offers me full independence, so I have no need for a carer, and it just allows me to be like everyone else really.
So personal wheelchair budgets was started summer last year, so 2017, and we were signed up as a champion site. So we were testing the water really with how it would work. What we're doing is, rather than looking at just mobility needs, we're looking at the wider health and wellbeing needs. So in the case of Dylan, his wheelchair needs were being met by a powered chair, but actually what it couldn't do was give him the independence that he wanted. He was still dependent on other people to help with transfers, to assist with things like shopping, domestic activities, all those things that everybody else takes for granted.
To be honest, that's just going to give me a new lease of life. Like, alright, people might think it's a seat, it moves around, but it's more than that for me, because it's not just about mobility, it's also like personal use, because it's allowing me to engage and do stuff what other people do. Just being a student really, like getting my degree and seeing where life takes me, and most of all enjoying the nightlife.
So as you can see in this particular, small video, wherein, it basically shares the details of an individual, which primarily was looking into, meeting certain needs. So for example, in this case, the NHS looked at the option of, obviously providing wheelchair for mobility, but later on they realized that Dylan in this case has broader healthcare needs, which would mean that he's a studying student, he wants to go to uni, he wants to socialize, he wants to travel, and obviously he wants to be able to do his daily chores on his own. And what the NHS then did was, apart from just providing a wheelchair, which allowed him to, be mobile and obviously take care of his social and, travel needs, they also provided him additional support, which is now being provided through a support and care worker that allows him to do his daily activities. And the plan which has been prepared essentially is now looking at meeting all his needs, not just his mobility needs, but his health and social care needs, his travel needs, and other needs which are related to socializing, so that he can live independently for the first time and not rely on carers over a period of time. And this particular bit which has been done by NHS in order to look at the needs and requirements of the individual is basically nothing but putting a care plan which is personalized and which is something meeting the requirements of Dylan and supports Dylan in terms of being able to do, one, deal with long-term illness, which is cerebral palsy, because as the age increases, the degradation of your brain and the coordination between your muscular movements decreases, and the person increasingly becomes dependent because of the deterioration in, what is called the mental, capability to be able to make decisions and control your movements or body movements. So in this case, they are working on a situation. They basically put a plan together, which basically is not related to one size fits all. And what they have tried to do is incorporate everything in terms of his understanding of what kind of care and support he needs. And then this care planning has been done by putting together a plan which takes into account not just his needs, his family, his near dear ones, and obviously some of the needs that he has when he travels or when he goes to university. So this particular video was shot in 2018. I'm presuming he would have passed or completed his university education by now, but this is an example of how care planning is actually done. And the care planning is done in a way wherein it benefits not just the local community, reduces the stress and burden on resources with the local authority, but if it is done right, the first way, which takes into account everything which the patient needs, then in that case, this care planning tends to be what is called the integrated care plan, which allows the individual to, one, receive the care, but also receive it in a way wherein they are able to utilize it, are happy getting that support, and then it allows them to work or live independently in terms of doing some of their functions, day-to-day functions on their own. Now, this nicely brings us into the topic of what. So when we talk about care, there is something called care planning that we need to look into. So when we talk about care and when we look at care planning, there is a particular way in which care planning as a process is done, and this care planning process is basically based on the person-centered approach. So when we talk about care planning and care planning model in general, what we tend to do primarily is to first identify what are the needs and requirements of the patient. Then we look at making preparations. So the preparations in terms of modification to the wheelchair, or preparations to, say, for example, adapt the standard wheelchair to the requirements of Dylan in terms of his height, weight, his movements, because the wheelchair is battery operated. So depending on, customization, which has to be done, is a part of preparation, just to give you an example. And then when we look at putting this plan together, we look at discussing this plan, which has been put together by the medics or the practitioners, and this plan is then discussed with the patient. And then last part of the plan is to primarily look at managing this plan, implementing this plan for the benefit of, how, say, for example, the patient would essentially be looking at utilizing this plan and receive the service and support that they need to be able to do their functions on a day-to-day basis. Now, this care planning or care plan, which is put together, is a comprehensive, individualized, plan, which is prepared and compiled both after discussions with, the looking into the condition of the patient, the treatments which are required, discussions with family members, and then within the practitioners to ensure that the plan or the set of activities which are put into the plan, which are going to be provided on a daily basis to help patient, live an independent and, fuller life while dealing with the illness or while dealing with the condition, would allow him to be content, happy, and, feel confident and, generally feel happy about receiving this particular care from, say, his set of carers. which could be healthcare assistants, it could be anybody in terms of medics and, the associated wider team, which basically looks at, providing, let's say, various elements of care which the patient needs. Now, when we talk about care planning, as it has been summarized here, what is care planning? So care planning is generally a conversation that you would have between the person and the healthcare practitioner. And this would be looking into account or taking into account all the conditions which the person, faces or suffers. And then the, set of, let's say, solutions are put together which will best meet the needs of the individual in a way wherein it allows them to live, an independent life or a whole, life in terms of without feeling the need to do any compromises or without having to do any compromises. This care plan is essentially owned by the individual. So you have to participate in the plan that is being put together for you in order for you to be able to receive this support and care from the practitioners. So you are owning this plan. This is also owned by the healthcare practitioners who would be implementing it, monitoring it, reviewing this plan on a daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly basis. If there are changes to be done, adjustments to be made, which will be done in discussions and in conjunction with the patient. And this would be as personalized document as possible and document everything which would be required, which the person would be needing when we talk about care planning. So when we talk in general about care and care plan, there are 2-3 things I think I pointed out in the first learning or the second learning outcome, wherein I'd given an example of a care planning template. And this care planning template is something which is put together by your GP surgery, or say, for example, by the hospital when you have had an operation or when you undergo certain sort of clinical procedure. And this particular plan, when put forward, which includes things about what your nutrition would be. For example, I don't know if most of you recall, but we discussed the plan would have things about your nutrition, your medication, your frequency of medication, reviews which will happen, whether you will be needing to come back to the hospital for a review in a week, 10 days, fortnightly, how long will it take for you to have a full recovery, and what are the various tests or milestones that you will pass during the course of your recovery, all that. And in terms of who all will be providing this particular support. So when you're in the hospital, it will be the nurses, the healthcare professional assistants who are providing the support. When you go home, if you had an accident and you're recovering from, say, for example, certain disability, or maybe you had broken a leg or, an arm or something like that, then in this case, the physiotherapy sessions would be involved, and you would be looking at taking those sessions to be able to walk properly and maintain your posture and balance. So there will be contributions by the occupational therapists. There will be visits by the nurses or healthcare professionals, to your residents to look at your medication pharmacy, or your GP surgery would be involved, because they will be looking at, obviously, reviewing your medication. And if any medication is not working, then obviously detailed tests would be conducted. They will be looking into allergies, and obviously a proper balanced diet or nutrition will be, advised during the course of your recovery, that this is what you need to eat. This is where you need to, eat a balance of carbohydrates and proteins, because if you've been in the hospital for a long time, then your muscles, undergo, disintegration, and obviously they become weak. And in order to build your body mass and your muscles again, you would be, obviously, say, in this case, example, prescribed physiotherapy sessions, and your nutrition would be, something which what you eat would be essentially prescribed by a nutritionist, so that you're having a balanced diet, and it helps you recover and build your body mass and muscle tone, so that you are able to obviously get back, on your feet and live a fully independent life. So this is an example of what all the care plan would have. And this could be as detailed as a 1-page document, could be as detailed as a 10-page document. It is an individualized personal plan, which is created by the patient, the family members, and the medics or the practitioners, which are essentially involved in the course of delivering this particular care or service to the patient. Now, with that bit of understanding that we need to have, we would need to now get into understanding some of the assessment criteria. Now, what I will also do is to also share a particular handout for those of you who want to read into how the care planning is done, and what the care planning involves as a 4-step process is going to be this particular handout, which basically is about a 15-20 minute read, about 4 or 5 pages, but generally takes you through the processes of what is a care plan, how it is put together, what are the key stages in the care planning process, and then how is it useful and put into practice, for the patient. Now, there is also something as a concept which I will introduce, a couple of slides later, and that process will be called ACP, Advanced Care Planning. Now, in certain cases, you put a care plan together, but if people are diagnosed with critical or terminal illnesses, that means at some stage these illnesses will become worse. Their effects, the outcome of these illnesses will become worse. Then in those cases, what you will generally do is there will be something which will be called an advanced care planning, and that will also be done for the patient. So we'll come to that as we go and discuss some of the assessment criteria. Now, any questions on this so far? Any questions at your end? With this base, overview and the discussions that we want to have, we want to make sure that you're aware of, what is a care plan, what is care planning. When we do the planning and put a care plan in place, that process is called care planning. What is an accepted model of care planning? It's a 4-phase model, 4-step model, which is used essentially to do care and planning this treatment for a particular patient. It is owned by the patient, and that is something which is explained in the care planning model of the process. Now, let's look at some of these and relate to what we've already discussed. Now, the first assessment criteria talks about purpose of care planning. Now, why do you think a plan is put into place? Any idea why do you think we need to put a plan in place? Just generally speaking, you sometimes have to put a plan in place on a daily basis as well. So, for example, if your childminder is called in sick and you have to drop your child and you also have to be at the office, then you would generally put up, you'd not go through this process as we are discussing in terms of paper plan and this and that. But a quick planning on that would be, I might have to get up a bit early and I might have to call the office to say, okay, I might be about half an hour late because I have to drop my kid off. And, what you will do is basically make sure that you're able to take your children, drop them to school, and from there on your way back to the office, you are able to chart out a route which will allow you a bit of diversion to go to the school and then go to your office. Now, you've done a bit of effective planning in your mind at this stage, which is to say, okay, what route I will take, how much will the traffic be, or how long will it take for me from my home to the school, from school to my office, and is there going to be, additional traffic during the time, and you compensate for that by starting a bit early. Now, here you've done a bit of planning, and that planning has primarily been to look into this contingency of your childminder, basically calling in sick. And so the responsibility of dropping your children off to the school and picking them up later in the afternoon falls onto you. But in the meanwhile, you have to also manage, your working in the office. And this is a simple plan or a planning that you would do, which is primarily for ensuring that this exigency or contingency which has come in can be incorporated in your daily schedule. Now, assume and extrapolate that to a fact that if care planning has to be done for somebody who's ill or is undergoing a treatment, has had an accident. So in this case, when we look at care planning, the planning is done primarily to assess the needs of the individual, and these needs of the individual in terms of how they can be best supported, in terms of making sure that the person is able to get well soon, get back to normal life as soon as possible, would be put together in this plan. And in this case, we think of 4, 5, or maybe more broad headings, things like treatment the person will go in undertake, what could be the recovery from the treatment, what would be the medication which will be required during the treatment, after the treatment, and for a longer term basis in order to support the recovery plan. You would also look at what is the additional support which is required, by, say, for example, the, in this case, the patient, in order to fully recover. So this long-term plan could be, say, I've given an example of physiotherapy sessions, or long-term plan would be if the patient, for example, has to come in and get further diagnosis or test results, tests done every 3 months, every 6 months, would all be put together in that plan initially. And then as some of the details become clear, assuming if the patient recovers fully, does not need the additional treatment, then the care plan would be amended and reviewed and amended from time to time to incorporate and ensure that, this is meeting the needs of meeting the needs and requirements of the patient. So it can be a 4-step process, as I mentioned. We start with identification, then go to preparation, then look at planning and discussing this plan with the patient if it meets and has all the requirements which have been incorporated. If it is not, if they missed out a few bits or certain things have not been included, then they can be discussed and included before the plan is put into some sort of a implementation stage. Now, when we talk about care plans, we also look at, why care planning is to be done. Now, this is done because irrespective of, how you receive support, at some stage, most organizations in health and social care setting have to document, and do some paperwork. This paperwork would allow them to either withdraw funds from the government, receive funding. It could be talking to the local authorities, wherein after a point in time when you are transferred back or you go back to your home and you need support at your home, at your place of dwelling, then in those cases, discussions with the local authority are done in order to ensure that support care workers come in and, help you out with your daily chores or some of the activities that you need to do in order to independently, say, for example, in order to enjoy your independence and, live independently. Now, this bit of planning is done primarily to ensure that there is some sort of a documentation and, let's say, paperwork available, which basically is available, one, for purposes of record, second, for the purposes of going through in a stepwise fashion how care is to be delivered or how, support is to be delivered. And the third is that this is required to be reviewed as your condition changes, as you get better. These plans are also reviewed, and they are reviewed to ensure that they are current, up to date, and meeting again the needs and preferences of the patient. Now, what all will the care plan include? So when we do care planning would be including or talking about what all does it include. Now, it's not difficult to understand if I put myself in the shoes of a patient and I say, okay, I am undergoing an operation, what kind of, say, for example, requirements I would have pre-operation, during the operation, and after the operation. So if you think of some of those things like, how is my assessment being done? So for example, if we talk about a patient M, just as an example, they are required to undergo, heart surgery. So in that case, they have a blockage in their arteries. Now, blockage in the arteries cannot be removed. The patient is 65 years old. We have a certain amount of background about the patient from the surgery, GP surgery, and the patient information record. And then because the patient is a senior citizen, say 65 years old, they've developed this as a condition and they need treatment. So things like what kind of treatment would be provided? How would you conclude whether an operation is required? So in those cases, generally patients are put through, for example, stress tests first. Things like they'll be asked to come into the hospital and a stress test will be done. That means they ask the person to, they give you let's say, a medicine which is injected in your body. And that basically allows them to increase your heart rate artificially. And then you're asked to run on a treadmill. And once this is done, the test results are noted. So in terms of how your heart is coming under stress, is it pumping blood, where it is not, and are there any effects that can be seen? Now, if this test is inconclusive, then the next test done is primarily asking you to do an electrocardiogram. That means your heartbeat is going to be observed, and you're going to be again put through a stress, but your heartbeat during that point of time is being noted using an instrument called ECG, or an electrocardiogram is generated. Now, if this also does not conclusively prove anything, then the third test will be angioplasty. That means they will basically put a probe inside and to check where the blockage is, and there is a dye, which is a radioactive dye, which is injected into your blood during the process of angioplasty, and that would essentially be allowing them to capture using X-ray and machines to see where the blockage of the blood is happening in the heart vessels. Now, all this is done before all this is done, or this is put into the, any sort of a planning into any sort of implementation. A plan is prepared, and that plan would be looking at understanding whether this treatment can be done through medication, what is the condition, is it genetic, how has it developed, loads of things will be looked at. Now, if the only outcome possible is that the patient has to undergo some sort of, say, an operation. Now, in this case, angioplasty, which means they will put in a stent, that would still mean that the person would need to then look at having due care after the stenting has been done. So in this case, who will provide the care, when the care will be provided, whether the nutrition will be changed, what kind of diet the patient will have, how many times the treatment will be done, whether the patient will be put into some sort of a regular medication like blood thinners, statins as we talk about, or aspirin in general in some cases, then and at what regular intervals further tests will be done, how the records will be stored, and then what are the wishes and personal preferences of the patient. Is the patient allergic to the dye? Will it cause any reactions when the dye is inserted for the purposes of, doing the angioplasty? What is the cost of these services, which would be coming as a cost towards the National Health Service? So all these things are taken into account. Now, if the patient was having an open heart surgery, that means the patient would have a long recovery plan, and that would have to be put into place because the hospital would discharge the patient at some stage. The patient would then require proper and regular care at their home in order to be able to get better. And that would mean that some of the activities that the patient does, for example, walking 3-4 miles or running or taking strenuous exercises, those would have to be done away with for a couple of months, because your stitches and other things which have been done or have been replaced, in terms of grafting, which has been done to look at removing the blockage through an open heart surgery, that would require time for healing. And in those cases, local authority would need to step in and provide support through healthcare workers, which will make regular visits to the home of the patient, and that would allow the patient to recover and recover healthily from that operation. So this all will constitute what is called care planning, and this is the usual process which is done in all cases when a patient is going to undergo treatment or receive treatment, which could be for long-term conditions or permanent conditions that they have both on primary care and healthcare or mental care. Now, in one of the slides, I put together a plan just to show what is the difference between a traditional plan and a person-centered approach plan. That means a personalized plan which has been drawn up in discussions with the patient. And this is a table which shows traditional planning and planning which has been done in accordance with taking into account preferences and needs and requirements of a patient. And this is just an example which I put forward, and the reason is that you should be able to understand how a care plan is put. This is an overview of a plan, not a detailed plan, but it shows how care planning has to be done in certain cases when patients have long-term illnesses or terminal illnesses or illnesses which are going to be with them for the rest of their life, and they would need continuous and personalized support to be able to live their life independently. Any questions on this so far? Right, we'll go to the second assessment criteria, which talks about outlined roles and responsibilities in care planning. Now here, we need to look at the MDT approach, the multidisciplinary team approach, because as you know, and I mentioned this a couple of times in this discussion of the unit in general, that when we look at healthcare practitioners, there is a team of practitioners which will essentially be involved in delivering care to the patient. And they would be things like doctors, junior doctors, consultants, nurses, healthcare professionals. It could be people in the administration, and they would all be working together to basically put together a plan which is required for the purposes of, providing care to the patients. So now, in this case, what we look at is a case of discussing roles and individual responsibilities for the patient. So in this case, if you think of some people in general which are going to be involved in delivery of that care, they would be people which we would see in a health and social care setting. And they would be doctors, nurses, occupational therapists or nutritionists, or we look at sometimes even if when patients have terminal illnesses and, end of life care is being provided, you would generally see that spiritual leaders or, ministers or, people who are related to churches or, padris and things like that also are called in order to take care of the wishes of the patient, that they would want to be, looking at certain ceremonies or, certain spiritual and religious needs. And when we talk about them, along with that, the most important component tends to be family members and, near dear ones of the patient, who would also be involved in terms of, the care which is being delivered to the patient. Now, here, if you think of any, because it talks about outlining the rules. So what I would suggest is there are lots of people which are involved, but we have to keep a particular, let's say, condition in mind with an example. And we will take the example of patient M, which is an example that I've included in the subsequent slide. And then we draw a table here to outline the rules. So on the left-hand side, you write the team which is involved in delivering care. And on the right-hand side, maybe some of their key functions or responsibilities that they have in terms of delivering this particular role. Now, one example that I've taken is an example of the nurse or the nursing aide. For example, in this case, a patient M has undergone a treatment, and what we need to look at is outlining what is the role and responsibility of the nurse or the nursing aide in the care planning process for the patient. So what we generally see is that the nursing aide would essentially be looking at the general status and mood of the patient, look at, difficulty in meals and bathing, and she would be concerned about patient safety in general, because these are the basic functions which the patient needs to do in order to live independently or, do some of the daily course which they have to be doing on a basis to, live and obviously survive. Now, if there are any gaps which are found in, say, for example, meal requirements, or if the nutrition is not being provided properly, which is a balanced diet, or if the patient has certain preferences like they are vegetarian or vegan, or need more proteinaceous diet in order to help build and recover the muscles, then in those cases, this particular observation is done by the nursing aide during the course of the patient being observed after the surgery. And then some of these important aspects are included in the care planning process, and roles and responsibilities are then given to individual people who will be working as carers or providing care to the patient. So in this case, either if you think of a residential care home, or you think of, say, for example, a patient who's undergone operation, at a hospital, then is where we will look at the role of that individual and what is their responsibility and what role do they play in terms of providing care to the patient. So when we look at people who work as care workers within a residential home, they'll be looking at their basic responsibilities being, if you put on your thinking hat, you would feel that they would be care workers who would be looking at helping dress the patient, wash and eat. They'll be providing company. They sometimes, sit down and have a chat. They play games. They share news. They'll be looking at, obviously, serving them meals. And they would also be looking at, providing basic needs, which could be needs in terms of, in the mornings, afternoon and evening, things like bathing, going to the toilet if they need access to the wheelchair. And then generally, encouraging them and motivating them to basically undergo the treatment or, be a part of allowing them to be a part of their life, to essentially help them to be able to, let's say, provide support and care so that they can live as independently as possible while being in the care home. So these kind of responsibilities would be, say, for example, for a care worker. And then you can also think of responsibilities which will be for a nurse when you are at the hospital. And this would help you outline, the process of, what could be the roles and responsibilities for various individuals. If we talk about broadly, my question to you would be broadly, what could be the role and responsibilities of the doctor, when a patient has undergone, say, for example, an operation at the hospital? Do you think, what can you think would be the roles and responsibilities of the doctor or the consultant which has operated on to the patient receiving the treatment at the hospital? Any ideas? Any thoughts on that? So if you look at the consultant, if for example, patient M has undergone, say, heart surgery, patient M, the consultant and the surgeons or the doctors who have conducted the surgery, when the patient is in the ICU and transferred from ICU to the general ward, they will be looking at their responsibilities would include taking rounds to monitor the health and recovery of the patient. They'll be looking at speaking to the patient to find out if there are any signs of any pain or any, they'll be also doing physical inspections to see if the wounds or the stitches are healing. They will also talk about the operation and the process and how the patient has gone through that with the members of the family, giving them a bit of guidance in terms of, how long will it take for recovery, answering their questions, looking at their, answering questions or queries which are related to concerns that the family members would have. And that would be the role of the doctor after the surgery has been done. But during the course of the surgery, the doctors would be anesthesiologists, surgeons, a heart surgeon or a consultant who would be looking and monitoring and, obviously supervising the operation which is done, so that the operation and the operation activities which are done in the operation theater are meeting the results and are able to help the patient get rid of that blockage in the heart. And that is a successful outcome, which the consultant would be responsible for. And that would be one of his responsibilities. So instead of going into, I would suggest we can analyze roles and responsibilities of all the different types of practitioners involved in health and social care setting, specifically in the care planning process. But generally, the idea would be to try and pick out a staff or a worker which is primarily, I would say at a lower level. And when I say lower level, I mean by that is that their responsibilities are more related to providing care and delivering the care firsthand. Now, doctors would be involved initially in the surgery, but their role in providing day-to-day care or weekly care or care during when the patient has been, when the operation has happened, would basically only be decline and will only be related to monitoring the recovery of the patient for a couple of days when the patient is in the ICU in the general ward. But if we talk about a nurse, a healthcare professional, a healthcare worker, or somebody who's visiting the person regularly for the next 2 or 3 months in terms of the plan which has been put forward to help patient recovery, that would be an ideal role to discuss and outline here for this particular task. Now, this is a template which I've got, which is just an example or a snapshot of, what a care planning process looks like and how the care planning, process and template looks like. Now, this is the 4 phases: identification, preparation, planning, and managing. And these 4 phases, when we talk about in the care plan, are basically documented on a very simple, I would say, easy to understand template. And that template basically has, some of the key steps which are taken into account, or key planning steps which are taken into account when a care plan is being put forward or being created for a patient. So if you look at the care planning model, and if you look at a care planning template, that is what I put forward here, just for idea and knowledge purposes, so that you're aware that this is how the process works, and what are the key roles and practitioners involved in developing this care plan for the patient. Any questions on this so far? Now, we also look at assessment criteria 5.3, which we'll talk about, describe how to ensure individuals which are involved in the care planning process look at the process for review. Now, one of the key things that we will look at is when a plan is put forward, the plan essentially allows the practitioners to follow it as a document, and then look at their part that they need to let's say fulfill in terms of providing care to the patient, or helping in providing support to the patient. Now, this particular planning process, as I've all mentioned in the start of the session, is that it involves having conversations with the patient, the family members of the patient, and the key people who are going to be involved in delivering the care to the patient, or this commissioning of that care, which is essentially required before it is put into implementation. And that would be the set of people which will be involved. Now, we also look at certain legislation or laws in this case. Obviously, the law mandates that we need to be able to have a plan in place for a person who's going to be receiving support and care for a longer duration or long-term purposes. And in this case, the plan is to be put together, one in consultation with the patient, making sure all the needs and requirements are being taken into account, and the patient is able to make independent decision in terms of providing input to that care plan. And then in some cases, local authorities are also called in because the person might have mental health conditions, disabilities, or any sort of learning disabilities, which would incapacitate the patient to be able to make decisions. And in those cases, family members of the patients are taken into account for doing this particular planning. Now, if the local authority feels that there is no there is biased approach, or the patient's needs and requirements could be oppressed, then in that case advocates or healthcare advocates are also introduced into the system, which work with the patient, are basically discussing putting a plan together on behalf of the patient and the patient needs, and are essentially going to be neutral, and they are going to take into account conditions which are going to be best served for putting this care plan into place. So here is where we will see the involvement of, say, people with disabilities or any sort of mental health illnesses, or when they have a capacity, when they are incapacitated in the ability to be able to make independent judgments and decisions. In those cases, you would see local authorities being brought in. Local authorities will speak to the family members if they feel there is biasness or oppression against, and the will and the let's say the preferences of the patient are not taken into account. They might introduce a healthcare advocate, and that advocate would then be looking into some of the care planning process which is done for the patient. Now, the plan that we put into place, and when we talk about how an individual is involved in this step, in this phase, would be to have local discussions, have great discussions, with the patient to understand their needs and requirements in detail. And in some cases, if the support cannot be provided from within the family or within the home, then in this case, there's an involvement of the local authority, which would be the councils providing, social care support, or, health social care worker support, in a particular area to be able to help in the delivery of care and services to the patient. So here, the local authority, which I mean by that is, it could be local authority outside the UK, but generally speaking, the councils and community health centers, which will be involved in helping in terms of delivering care to the patient. Now, when we talk about the process and the stages which are involved in planning, we also talk about how review has to be done. Because these plans have to be reviewed. These plans also sometimes need changing. They need amendments. They need to be, adjusted. Now, that process is going to be called review. Monitoring is also done, and that will also be covered under reviews, because if there is a good amount of money, resources, time and effort being spent by the local authority, and the care being provided needs to be monitored, then at some stage, local authority would also put a monitoring process in place to find out, is the care which is being delivered making a difference to the patient's way of living? Is it reaching the patient in terms of the services? So, for example, if there is additional support given in terms of finances, or additional support given through the universal credit, for example, in the UK, with people being on benefits, is additional benefits being given, then in those cases, the local authority would also do monitoring to ensure that these benefits are reaching the intended patient and are allowing the patient to be able to use them for the purposes of receiving, or making sure that they're receiving this care, and obviously it helps them in their way of living independently. Now, some of these plans are reviewed on a quarterly and monthly basis. Some of them will only be reviewed on a yearly basis, and that would also constitute the planning stages of the care plan. Now, when a review has to be done, there are a couple of ways through which reviews can be done. Reviews can be self-led reviews, it could be peer reviews, it could be review from a distance. That means sometimes reviews are done remotely, and then there are reviews which are done face-to-face. For example, a face-to-face review would be you had a blood test done, and your blood cholesterol has come out high, you would receive a call from your GP surgery, and that review would be a face-to-face, because the GP will invite you in. They will talk to you in terms of why this is, why your blood cholesterols are heavy. They'll ask you questions. They'll ask you to change your lifestyle, your eating habits. They will ask you to concentrate on, having certain healthy foods. And in general, the consultation will also say, let's start some medication. And that would be example of a face-to-face review. A review from a distance could be a review which happens remotely. That means it is done through phone or online. Now, during COVID pandemic, we saw if elderly people, or if you needed an urgent appointment with the GP, obviously most of these surgeries introduce what is called an online review, and you were able to see the doctor and obviously do an online video session, and that allowed you to receive your consultation and your medication through the pharmacy. Now, peer-led review tends to be when if there are lots of people involved in providing care and delivering care to the patient, then in those cases, groups of friends, family members, are also involved in reviewing the implementation of the plan and also the output of the plan. And that would be a peer-led review. A self-review tends to be when you look at your own needs and requirements and then submit it to the local authority. For example, if you were given a wheelchair, we go back to the example of Dylan. He was 18 and he was given a wheelchair, assuming, once he finished his university in 3 years' time, assuming if the battery of the wheelchair has got worn out, the tires have got worn out, and it needs a bit of repair, then he would review his own condition in terms of the access and the usability of the wheelchair, and then would provide details like photographs, or maybe have a conversation with the healthcare worker and say, okay, I've done the review, the battery wears off, the time used to be 30 minutes, but now it's 2 hours. It discharges very quickly, and it doesn't travel the distance that it was supposed to when initially I got it. The seat has worn off, or my tires need replacement, or anything that he feels that he needs to have changes done because the requirements have changed, or if there is if there are wear and tear issues in the wheelchair, then that would be a self-review which the person will do, and then provide a report, or have a discussion with the authorities to say that, okay, this change is required, and then appropriate changes would be done. Now, for the discussion of most of the assessment criteria that we are looking at in this learning outcome, which is the principles of care planning, what we are looking at is I put together a case history of, say, for example, a case study, which is the case study of M. Now, in this case, what we want to be able to look at is the individual is, a 67-year-old woman. She has mild mental health problems, and also, because of her age, she is now, she's requiring what is called support in order to be able to do her daily duties. Now, obviously, she wants to stay at home, but the healthcare authorities or the local authorities have done an audit, and obviously they find that she would best get the care in a care home. And obviously, after making this decision and making the patient aware of the substantial medical needs, including diabetes and care that she needs for her mental health illness and obviously movement needs, they've decided that it will be best for the patient to be moved into a care home, which will allow her to live a fuller life, independent life, and obviously have 24 hours care, so that if anything is to happen, she is got immediate attention, and obviously things in let's say accidents could be avoided if the care is not provided on time, and they would be more suitable for her in the care home. Now, when this has been done, she has obviously gone against the decision that I don't want to leave home, and the local authority has spoken to obviously the court, and in this case the court has allowed that she could remain at home, and she could ask for whatever help and support she needs rather than being transferred onto a care home. Now, with this decision in mind that she is going to be now provided care at home, and she has multiple conditions like diabetes and mental health illness, and obviously because of her age has restricted movement, the council in this case would put together a local plan or a care plan, and that care planning that they would do and put in place would essentially be looking into covering all the various stages that she would need care for, and how this care is to be delivered to her in her home or in her own home. And that is explained, in this particular, example. And that I would suggest is what you could take up also when you do your assessment and your assignments. So think of a similar example by putting in a bit of introduction of a case study, and then it'll allow you to create a care plan, talk about care planning, and obviously roles and responsibilities which are involved in terms of delivering this care, and care to an individual. Now, any questions on this so far? What we've discussed. Now, the extension activities typically would be looking into, understanding what is called, the analysis of barriers which we face when we do care planning, and then in terms of review, of challenges which are faced when the individual outcome and needs are not being met. So let's look at briefly, very quickly, in terms of the analysis in terms of barriers. Now, first of all, let's think of what are the barriers that you can face when you are delivering care to a patient. Anybody, any thoughts on what could be the barriers that you generally face when you're delivering care to a patient? What could be the barriers? Any ideas? Okay, when we talk about barriers, we talk about barriers like cultural barriers, technological barriers. We talk about, barriers which could be in terms of lack of training. It could be barriers which are lack of knowledge. It could be barriers which are related to diversity. It could be barriers in terms of, say, communication barriers, sometimes ambiguous communication or talking in jargons, or using acronyms which might not be familiar with the patient, and they would be barriers. Now, the main part of the task is to look at how do we overcome barriers. Now, one of the things which I mentioned about care planning, and we talk about advanced care planning. So advanced care planning is normally done, when we generally look at a care plan which is put together, and then we look at advanced care planning, which is required to be done when people have long-term illnesses. So when we talk about advanced care planning or ACP, we basically mean that we need to be looking at having conversations and making decisions which are going to be looking into how care would be delivered in the future with the healthcare practitioners involved in delivering care to you. And this would mean that you're looking into taking into account the wishes, the fears, the desires, and obviously long-term conditions of the patient, and then suitably looking at putting a plan in place which would, look at these conditions and incorporate solutions to these conditions over a long-term basis or on a long-term basis. Now, when we talk about, advanced care planning, we look at lots of things. So there would be things that you will look into in terms of government support. You would look into financial costs. You would look at, if the illness could, let's say, the conditions which the patient is undergoing. Say, for example, in terms of the illness, can the illness deteriorate? Can the condition become worse? And those will have to be taken into account when we talk about the ACP or advanced care planning. Now, when we look at how do we overcome barriers, some of the barriers that are listed. So one of the barriers is that we need to look at when we talk about Britain and when we talk about the National Health Service, it's a multicultural setup. So here, one of the clear barriers that we can overcome is by improving diversity within the workforce, which works within the National Health Service. People come from different backgrounds. There are different type of, people who receive care. They come from different backgrounds, beliefs, cultures, and have different values. So improving diversity in terms of workforce within the National Health Service would help deal with patients in a much more effective and a better manner, because there would be people who would understand their culture, can relate to their beliefs and values, and then tailor and provide some of these services in a much more effective and better way. And that would be looking at overcoming one of the barriers by looking at improving diversity. Now, the other bit that we talk about is in terms of looking at how does the National Health Service, or when we look at providing care to the individuals, look at embracing innovation. That means introduction of new technology, introduction of in places, obviously some of these systems are still new. The introduction of person-centered care as an approach within different organizations, if they are being set up, the availability of resources which are latest technique, machines and tools, or equipment which could basically help in improving care or providing effective care has to be looked at. And this would be one of the ways through which some of the health and social care settings, if they embrace technological innovation, would help in removing the barriers in terms of planning which is done. Now assume a simple example of innovation in this case that I would say is that if you have to do a care, if you have to prepare a care plan, so prepare a care plan. Now, if you are doing it on paper, and obviously there's no software available within the organization, then obviously this care plan, although being prepared by the healthcare practitioners, will be available, but it will be available locally. Digitized or electronic version of this, if it is made available using an implementation of a software or a solution within the setup, wherein the care plan is then available to the patients, the family members, the practitioners, and any person which is associated with providing care to the patient, would make it easier, less time consuming and less taxing for this document to be shared amongst various set of people who are involved in delivering the care to the maybe delivering the care at a care home, or maybe in a hospital, or maybe at home. So this is talking about embracing innovation. Then we talk about collaborative approach. So when we talk about collaborative approach, there is I don't know how many of you were listened or heard this proverb which says it takes a village to raise a child. Now this is an African proverb which basically is something which is very closely related to what is called person-centered care, the 6 principles of person-centered care. So when we talk about person-centered care, in general, we look at that there is no one individual which is going to be responsible for essentially providing care to the patient in most cases. So in this case, that means a whole village involved. That means if you have to focus on providing care to the patient, there would be different sets of people which are involved: nurses, doctors, clinics, medicians, physicists, pharmacists, lots of it, depending on the care that you're receiving. Now in this, what it means is that when different organizations are involved in providing care or providing integrated care using a care plan which has been put forward for a patient, then in those cases, what we have to do is ensure that there is a collaborative approach or teamwork approach, or there are close relationships. This is relating to the previous learning outcome, that they will need to work closely together to be able to make this plan work for the patient. And in this case, what they have to do is there is a close working, which would mean building of relationships. There is partnership working. It could be that the hospital, when the patient is discharged, after that the care is provided through local authority and community healthcare centers, and that would mean that the local authority healthcare centers and the patient would need to work together to be able to receive this care and support at their end, and that would mean that they will have to collaborate. Now, we also sometimes think, when we talk about barriers, that we need to look at rethinking on compliance. Now, there are lots of acts and legislations which are there, but sometimes these acts and legislations have to be implemented in a way wherein it is for the benefit of the patient. And this is, again, they have to be thought of from a point of person-centered care, which is being delivered to the organization, by the organization to the patient. That means the compliance has to be kept in mind that it is providing care to the patient, but it is also taking into account compassion, competence of the individual involved in delivering the care, clear communication. There is courage and commitment from the healthcare worker to be able to deliver this care, which is patient-focused, and it is allowing the patient to receive the benefits of the care being delivered. And in this case, compliance and compliance measures sometimes have to be, I would not say relaxed, but have to be observed in a way wherein they are meeting the requirements of the 6 C's of quality of care and the person-centered approach that we talk about, or principles of person-centered approach that we talk about. And this could be some places, healthcare setting, hospitals, rethinking about how compliance is interpreted and implemented within the organization. So these could be some of the ways, broadly speaking, how you would look at overcoming, barriers which are generally, faced when, we are looking at implementing care plans for patients. Any questions on this? Feel free to ask me through the chat room. We'll quickly look at the last assessment criteria, which is the criteria which talks about reviewing the challenges of how care plans are developed for the needs of individuals and how these outcomes on the care plans are agreed. Now, in this case, I would like to give an example. Now, if a care plan is being put into place, say for the patient M, which is that she has diabetes, she has mental illness, and she is also, because of her age, restricted in terms of movements. Now, when a plan is put in place, first thing is the plan is shown to the patient, because the patient needs to agree to that plan which has been put forward for her by the local authority, by the healthcare advocate, and people who are involved in delivering the care to the patient, which is patient M in this case. So she would need to understand how and what is being planned, how this will be delivered, who are the people who are involved, and at what frequency this support will be provided to her, and what is her role in receiving this care from the person involved or the local authority involved in delivering that plan. Now, they would be the most important bit, because you're taking into account the buy-in. That means the yes to that plan which has been put forward, taking into account her needs, which is the patient M needs. Now, when we talk about these plans, and if these plans are too complex and they are too, for example, detailed, sometimes you would see that they would not have a buy-in, or the plans would essentially not make sense to the patient. So that means they have to be interpreted and made in a way wherein it does not pose, say, for example, issues, but also pose challenges in terms of implementation of these plans when they are put into place for a particular patient like patient M. Now, when we look at these plans being put forward, we are also looking at ensuring that there is a way to deliver this plan. And if I show a care plan as an example in detail in terms of how it has been put together for patient M, then we look at taking into account pretty much lots of things which are related to the local authority, who is going to be providing the financial resources, and say, for example, people who would be looking at giving this care to patient M, and then look at what kind of support in turn they would need from some of the other people. When I say some of the other, is social and healthcare workers, looking at discussions with family members, and then also looking at participation from the patient M, the healthcare advocate, because the patient M, remember, has health illness, which is that she has mental illness, mild medical illness, which basically she needs helps in terms of making the, she lacks the capacity to make decisions, let me put it this way. So she would need help from the healthcare advocate, which would then, allow her to give this information in a way she understands better, and then take her preferences into mind when coming out with, say, for example, a decision. So all these stages are reflected in this care planning in terms of challenges which the local authority, the healthcare advocate, the healthcare workers, and the practitioners face, including the patient M, when this is put forward. And this particular flow chart essentially explains, what are the challenges and how these challenges are met by taking into account having discussions with relevant people and authorities, so that integrated care could be provided to patient M, which will deal with her diabetic problem, which would deal with her movement related problems because of age, things like arthritis, and and then also take into account the mental health illness that she has, wherein she does not have the capacity to make decisions unless somebody is speaking to her and explaining that in a bit more detail, and that is where the role of healthcare advocate comes in. So this particular analysis that we do of the entire care plan, by taking into account the perspective of the local authority, the health and social care workers, the healthcare advocate, and the patient M, is nothing but a critical review of challenges which are faced when care plans for patient M are put and agreed, are agreed and then put into practice. So this is what this particular task in terms of extension activity would cover. in terms of discussing in detail about the challenges. And here, before you discuss the challenges, you'll have to have a care plan in place. And that is why I put together I've shown you a bit of a template that you could use and a case study or a scenario like patient M in order to discuss the merit and the distinction activities. Any questions on today's session so far? So I would want you to look at the additional handouts which I've provided on Moodle, and these additional handouts on Moodle that I've provided are going to be useful for you to look into a bit more detail in terms of what we have covered today in learning outcome. And one of them is a care planning template, essentially from the National Health Service. And this is a detailed document, but it is a specific document for people who are undergoing, dialysis, when they have a kidney problem or the kidney fails and they need an external kidney transplant, and they will need a kidney transplant. And for the time they are on a waiting list, they would need what is called dialysis. And this is an example of a mini care planning document generally done for people who are going to receive a kidney transplant and have a need of dialysis, regular dialysis. So this is a large plan which has been put together by the National Health Service, for a particular area wherein people have conditions wherein the kidneys have failed and are waiting for a transplant. And this would give you an overview of how planning is done, on that side in terms of for patients primarily who are on the list to receive a kidney transplant, and in the meanwhile will also need regular dialysis, in order to do their day-to-day functions. Now, the second handout that I've got, which I want you to also look at, would be a handout which is related to roles and responsibilities of people involved in care planning. And this is where I've given a bit of a background. And this background then gives you a bit of a template here, which basically talks about the role, the care planning model, which has the 4 phases: identification, preparation, planning, and manage, which is given here. And then some columns which basically allow you to put appropriate steps in place, or at least think of the roles and responsibilities these individuals carry out: doctors, junior doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants, practitioners, and that can be used and done as an exercise. The third document that I've got is a document which is primarily on the distinction task that we've discussed, which talks about the challenges that are faced essentially when we are developing the care plan, and how the agreed outcomes are discussed and put into the care plan. Now, if I say the patient would get better in 3 months, now if this timeline is wrong, then there is a discussion and debate which will happen between doctors, medics, healthcare workers, to say that recovery from an accident, which is a car accident, and the person maybe had a disability, or has dislocated and fractures were there in multiple limbs, but in order for the patient to start living independently without any social support would require 3 months is the initial estimate. But how is this agreed, how is this put into place, is something that is a challenge which needs to be agreed and discussed in detail with the patient. And if the patient does not take physiotherapy sessions, for example, this 3 months could become 6 months easily. And that is what is an example which has been discussed in this particular document, which is a handy document which takes into account lots of factors which could be faced. And this is what you get to see as a graph that I put primarily on the PowerPoint slide as a flow chart essentially. And these additional documents would then help you to study and understand the learning outcome 5 in detail with regards to care planning, and the care planning process. So with this, we come to the end of today's session. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now. Otherwise, you can also drop them to me on the email. And then we'll catch up next week with regards to covering our learning outcomes 6 and doing a discussion on the assignment for this particular unit. So any questions, anybody? Right, okay.